Thank you so much, Jocelyn. So, like growing up, I grew up in church. I grew up in a household with my mom and dad. They were married for the majority of my life. Um, Due to like alcohol, drug, and some abuse, like we would be placed in foster care with my grandparents. There was times when we'd be placed in like a group home, foster homes that we didn't, necessarily know the family. So fast forward, like I got out on my own at the age of like 15 or 16. My mother threw me out in the streets. And like during the times when things like this would happen, my mom and dad will be split. So my dad, like he wasn't around when like the abuse would take place. My dad was always more so like the level headed one, and just the calm one. So my mom, like she would put us out and let us come back, put us out and let us come back. So with the last time, I just never went back. And so I kind of was left to find my way in the streets. And this led to a lot of drug and alcohol use, like on my end. Um, a lot of, like being promiscuous. Um, I even found my way into some prostitution, um, and just using like drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism, and always just drowning myself in work. I did begin working at the young age of like 14. So from that point on, I would just work and drug and alcohol use. Um, and fast forward up until a few years ago, like I had later on, rebuilt a relationship with my mom. As I got older, like she apologized, for everything that went on as we were younger. She apologized for, throwing me out in the streets and stuff like that. But like it was good to hear the apology, but it didn't subside the pain that I felt. Um, so I ended up going and working my way into homosexuality. I began dating other women. Um, and in one of those relationships, like I packed up and left and moved, a few hours away from where I was at, stayed out there for a few years. And then I came back to to here in Michigan, where I'm from. Um, and shortly after I came back, I had an accident with my eye. I got hit in the eye, with a high heel. And so I went into surgery, had two surgeries on my eye. And at that time, I'm in college. Um, my mom had helped me enroll in college to help me support myself and, further my education. But with that happening, like I had to drop out, So with that, I went back to drugs and alcohol, too much free time on my hands. I always continued to work, whenever I would be on binges and stuff like that. Like I never lost a place due to my drug use or anything like that. I was always stable. Um, so fast forward a little more, I ended up getting pregnant and I got pregnant with a baby boy. And so I ended up having him. And about a month after I had him, I got married to a woman. Um, but after I had him, I suffered from a really deep depression. Like I had heard about postpartum and stuff like that, but I never had done any research, or I never really looked into it. And so when my son became about 6 months old, like I started getting symptoms of depression. I didn't even know what it was. I would just, I felt like out of it. I just didn't feel like myself, and I would just cry for days and days and days. Some nights I would wake up out of my sleep crying. Um, and then I began to revisit all those moments from my childhood, just things that I guess, kind of buried and never dealt with. And so revisiting those moments, it was like everything that I didn't want for my son. So in the midst of that, like I started seeking out therapy, and it was helping somewhat, but I guess I wasn't getting the full extent of therapy because I really couldn't be honest, about some things. In the midst of that, I was using drugs again, and I didn't want my therapist to know that, because want I didn't want my therapist to, work against me, so to speak. So I kept that as a secret, and I just kept attending therapy. And like it got so bad that she wanted to admit me into like a psychiatric facility. And so fast forward into that, honestly, like God took me out of the depression. God took me out. Looking back now, I know that it was God. Like I had always heard of God and stuff like that. It was never a doubt in my mind, was there a God? I always was like, I know it's a God, but I never sought out a relationship with him. Growing up, we grew up in this really religious setting where it was like we were taught you can't go to church if you dress like this. You can't come in if you got tattoos or piercings. And, it was just like that type of, what we sat up under. So with the ways that I lived, I knew like my main thought was, okay, I can't approach God like this. And oftentimes, like we're always taught, especially in Black households, we're always taught that you can't question God, and just different things like that. So I knew with the ways that I was living, I'm like, okay, I don't want to approach God and then play in God's face. So that kept me running away from God for years. And I'm like, if I'm going to approach God, I want to be serious with him. But right now, it was like right now I'm having too much fun. So I kept living like that. And then in 2019, I ended up getting incarcerated. Well, actually in 2017, I ended up having charges pressed on me. It was a young lady that pressed charges on me, and they pushed out my case for a couple of years, and they began bringing it back up in 2019. And the year prior to that, like I had this big fallout with my mom, and she stopped talking to me. So a year later in 2019, when I'm sitting in the jail cell, I'm like, okay, God, like how did my life end up here? And so I got into this schedule of every day. Before I would do anything, I would open my Bible, and I started to notice a pattern of, I would just open up and read in random spots. And I would notice a pattern of, I will always land in the space of honor your mother and father. So I knew in that moment, I'm like, this is God speaking to me about getting the relationship right with my mom. So I did my time. And when I came home, they gave me 90 days in jail with 2 years of probation. The day I came home, I went straight over to my mom's house and I apologized for the things that happened the year prior. And she accepted my apology, and we were right back, connected, and just like it had never stopped, because she stopped talking to me for the whole year prior to that, because I said some really hurtful stuff. And, I've never taken that stance, but I did. Emotions were blazing, and we were drinking, and it was just crazy. And I said some really disrespectful things, and she stopped dealing with me. So I went and made things right. And about 3 weeks after that, she was helping me find a job and stuff, because when I came home, I had lost everything that I had. So a few weeks after that, one day, like for years, she will always have this talk with us about, when I die, I want you guys to do this and do that. So one day we're riding in the car. She takes me to the hair store to go get me some stuff so I can get my hair done, and, just give me a few dollars, and just giving me a encouragement talk. But she then started having this talk of when I die, but she started mentioning like stuff that I had never heard before. And so I'm like, well, what's going on? Like, is it something that I need to know? So she didn't really say much. So then I seen her the next day, and she started having that talk again. So then 2 days after, no, the very next day again, she calls me after she gets off work, and she's like, I just got off work. I'm going to go home and change my clothes and get back out and do some DoorDash, make some extra money. And then she starts saying, when I die, this, that, and the other. So the next day, I'm at my sister's house, and my mom was actually getting ready to take me. I was waiting on her. She was going to take me. I had found a job, and she was going to take me to fill out the paperwork. And so I'm at my sister's house, and I get a call from my sister, like, where are you at? No, she texted me. She said, where are you at? I need to talk. And at this time, I'm on probation. I had just got released from jail. I'm thinking, maybe my probation officer is looking for me. They're trying to set me up. Like, that was my first thought. And so then my aunt comes and texts me too, like, well, where are you at? You need to stay there. I got to talk to you. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I wonder what's going on. So I'm initially I'm thinking like maybe it was my grandma or my cousin, um, and so they both get there, and long story short, like they walk in, and I could tell they had both just been crying, and so they look at each other, and then they look at me, and I'm just, I'm so anxious. I'm like, what's going on, And my aunt is like, your mother's gone, and I had just talked to her the day before, and so that was a jump start. Like I immediately like was just lost, like what happened that fast, And so trying to deal with that, trying to satisfy probation and stuff, I resorted right back to what I knew, drugs and alcohol. And so while on probation, I kept drinking and stuff, kept getting violated in and out of jail. And I just got really sick and tired of being really sick and tired. Years went by. Honestly, I was so numb from like losing my mom. And then not to mention like months after I lost my mom, I lost my very best friend. And then the following year I lost another friend. And then the following year I lost another friend. So you remember how I mentioned about how often in black households we're taught not to question God, right? There was an episode that I had a meltdown where I had all these questions that I had for God, and I expressed this to my aunt, and she's the one that told me, you can ask God these questions. And later on that day, like I had started reading my Bible and stuff like that because the road that I was going down, it was like I could feel God yanking and tugging at me, like death was around the corner for me. So I started cutting out secular music. I started getting in my Bible. Um, and that particular day, as I was reading my Bible, I kept on reading. I was doing it on my phone, and it was a link at the bottom of the page. And I clicked that link, and God led me to scripture, and He answered every single question that I had in that moment, had expressed to my auntie. And so what's surprising is it blew my mind that God had answered my questions. He validated my questions that I had. And so in that moment, and I'm not going to say the transition happened overnight because it was a process. I continued drinking and drugging, but the closer I drew into God, the more my appetite changed for those things just naturally. So one of the first steps that I took was I made it up in my mind, because when God comes in, He provides you with a love that you've never felt before. He fills this void that we look to feel in so many other things, but I got a taste of that. And so I started by changing the crowd of people that I was around. Stop going to those same places that I had been going to. Stop answering those phone calls. Stop, doing things like that, and just really spending time in my Bible. Um, and the more that I would spend time getting to know God, because I was hungry for it, I started, instead of listening to secular music, listening to podcasts that would, speak about the gospel. I would listen to gospel versus R&B or rap music, and being intentional about what I was feeding into my spirit. Like I would walk around all day with a sermon playing in my ear, just to get it in my spirit, even if I wasn't listening to it. And I started finding, God led me to a group of people, like young folks on TikTok, and I started joining the Bible studies and became active in that group, people to hold me up. And then the more I started doing that, the more God just led me out, to the wilderness to develop this one on one relationship with Him. And in the wilderness, God has handed me a mirror and showed me how to take accountability for my actions. And as you mentioned, like healing is an ongoing process. Every day is not perfect. Um, but it's really just about having a willing heart and also intentionality and being authentic. because you have to be real about the action, the role that you played in interactions. Of course, people do have done stuff to hurt us. When I first asked God for healing, because I was so hurt, just not just from my mom, but over the years, when I first asked God for healing, you know what He told me to do? He told me to forgive. And not only did He tell me to forgive, but what He told me was don't forgive people just to say you did it, but like actually look like within yourself and forgive, like release people. And then He had me backtrack and apologize to the people that I was unforgiving for. He showed me how, okay, yeah, this person may have hurt you, but that doesn't make it right for you to harbor, that in your heart. You weren't perfect in those situations. You've done some things to hurt other people too. And it's like, you know what, God, I have. I wasn't always the best person. I haven't always had the best attitude. I haven't always talked to people the right way, you know. Absolutely. And you know what? If you reject that, it's like you're rejecting God. You kind of just got to surrender and submit. And it's like, God, have your way. It doesn't always feel good. But when I say I've never, it's such a freeing experience. I'm not bound to those experiences. I'm not bound to those people. And like I said, it doesn't happen all at once. And God knows that. He doesn't rush the process. He's actually shown me like you need to have some patience. Don't rush the process. you know? Like I said, God led me to that group, and then he pulled me away from that. My connection with God has been mostly one on one because what He's shown me is He really wants to get to know me up close and personal, and He doesn't want me to fall off into that feeling like I have to go through somebody else to get to know Him. When Jesus died, that veil was torn, so you can approach the throne of grace freely at any given time. And He's shown, God is always available. He's always talking. So He's shown me how to go throughout my day. I talk to God just like He's one of my friends. God, what you doing? How you feeling? What should I do about this? What you want me to wear today? Just stuff like that. So He's shown me how to become intimate with Him. God instructed me to start this podcast. First, He started instructing me to share my testimony via like social media and stuff. And when He first told me that, like, I thought that was the craziest thing ever. Then He told me to start the podcast for people that need to hear, the things that He's delivered me from. So out of obedience, I did. And now I've shifted more so into like bringing on guests to share their story too. So that people, well, let me back up some. I consider the platform to be an encouragement tool, so that people can see, whatever it is that you're going through, like you're not alone. We all struggle with something. We all are going through something. Like life is not made to be perfect. We're not perfect. So I use the platform as a method of displaying, that you can overcome anything. I would say just don't quit. Um, don't compare your journey to anyone else's. All of us have a unique journey, and yours may look different from the next person's. And just because you are not traveling as fast as the next person on your journey does not mean that you're not making movement and taking steps. And just be always be like your true authentic self. It doesn't matter how anybody else is, how anybody else feels, because we all struggle with something. Nobody is perfect, and don't look for validation in people, and just because we are born into these families, like we don't have any choice over the families that we're born into. But just because we're born into these families does not mean that you have to have these people in your lives. Sometimes we expect these people to be here for us because it's our mom, our dad, our sister, or our cousin, and it just doesn't work that way. But just know that God knows your specific needs, and He will align you with people that will fulfill those roles in your life so that you're not lacking that. Um, and always just know that God loves you, and always be vocal with God. Tell him exactly how you feel, whether it's frustration, anger, sadness, happiness. Express that to him. He knows how we feel, but he wants to hear it from you because he wants to interact with you like that. And he does talk back. When you're expecting God to speak back to you, pay attention to everything around you because he speaks in multiple ways. And last but not least, don't put him in this box. What God told me when I first started with him was everything that you thought you knew about me up until this moment, get rid of that and let me show you who I am. No problem. Thank you so much for having me.